On stage, please welcome Chief Diversity, Inclusion, and Corporate Social Responsibility Officer at Bank of America, Cynthia Bowman. President and Chief Executive Officer of Bridgewater Interiors, Ron Hall. President and Chief Executive Officer of Kelly, Peter Quigley. And to moderate the discussion, please welcome Executive Advisor at BridgeDetroit and host of Detroit Today and American Black Journal, Stephen Henderson.
Okay, before we start, I just want to say, I'm a native Detroiter and someone who lives in the city now, raising my kids there. There's not another way to describe the feeling that you get watching this kind of data be presented about where you live and who you are, other than just devastation. It's not surprising, but it's a very stark look in the mirror. It's a very dark picture of what life is like in the city that I love. So really, really great presentation, but very difficult to sit through. Also want to talk to the audience just a little bit about how we're going to do this. We're going to have a conversation up here, but we're also going to take some questions from the audience. And you can participate by going to the conference app and clicking on agenda, select this forum, the intersection of business and equity objectives, select Q&A at the top of the screen and submit your question, and then it'll show up on this iPad, and I can include you in our conversation up here. So I want to start with our panelists talking just a little about what we saw and how the work that you're doing in your businesses connects with the data, connects with these problems. Is it a driver of some of these problems, or is corporate America responsible for some of what we're seeing? And the work that you're doing, how does it push back? How does it push us in a different direction? Cynthia, I'll start with you.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. It's, sometimes although the data is difficult, it's important because without some discomfort, there's not growth. So I'll start with that. But thank you for having me. I guess I'll start a little bit about and take an angle from Bank of America. And when you think about diversity and inclusion in context of the communities which we serve, I believe they go hand in hand. One of the things that we talk about at the bank is the power of and it's about driving profits and purpose. The purpose, as you heard from our CEO yesterday, is all about the work that we do to drive responsible growth that's in a sustainable way. That includes all the work that we do, and not only for our employees, but in the community. I will tell you that it is absolutely driven from the top. And so we do think we as a corporation have a role in creating economic opportunity and addressing issues around racial equity in the communities we serve, but also for our own people. And that's a lot of part about my job. When I think specifically about what that means, it means it's embedded in business reviews, meaning diversity, equity, inclusion. It's in talent reviews. It's in performance management. And we hold leaders accountable. Brian's accountable to our board. It also means that we believe in both representation and inclusion, and also the outcomes that we drive in our community. Our organization is 50% women. We are 50% people of color. We look like the world we live in, and we want to look like the world we live in at every level. And that's why you see a diverse board. Our leadership team, you see Brian's leadership team is incredibly diverse. He has 8 women that directly sit on his management team. 4 of those women lead 8 lines of business. 2 of those leaders are Black African American. 2 of those leaders are Asian. 2 of those leaders are Hispanic Latino. So it's not about just talking the talk around and looking at the data. It's about walking the walk and specifically implementing and holding ourselves accountable to drive progress.
Ron?
I completely agree. Bridgewater Interiors was really born of the supplier diversity and inclusion efforts in the automotive industry. We're headquartered in Detroit, down near the Ambassador Bridge. We employ about 1,400 or 1,500 people in the Metro Detroit area between our Detroit and Warren facilities. And from day one, it's been a part of the company's DNA to have strong representation at all ranks of the company, to demonstrate that you could employ an inner city workforce at the highest levels of manufacturing performance and deliver results to shareholders and stakeholders. We were talking a little bit backstage about the importance of leadership in driving these efforts and how if you have that, it really is possible. We have very similar numbers. Our senior leader team is extremely diverse, women, racial minority persons. We are strong. We lean in on corporate DE&I efforts. We're in a joint venture with Adient, large publicly traded firm, and frankly, I think are able to lead the way inside the enterprise to help demonstrate how some of these things can be done. Economic opportunity and greater economic equity is the last bastion of the civil rights movement. I was raised with that ideal. The company is based on those ideals, and we're really proud of the fact that we provide a lot of solid middle-class jobs with great benefits and tuition reimbursement and all these other things for our employees. I'm especially proud of the fact, as we talk about providing equity and pathways up, that more than 40% of my management team is comprised of former hourly team members, and we're completely unionized in our Michigan facilities. And so these things are possible when you talk about the power of and. You can be union and deliver great results. You can be union and have great labor management relations. You can perform at the highest levels in a very technical space within the industry, even though it hasn't been done in some of these areas where people haven't had access to these jobs before.
Camille, I'm going to come back to you, but Peter.
Yeah, thank you, and good morning, everyone. It's great to be on this panel. I think it's appropriate for me to maybe just call out the Chamber for having me on this panel, this being a Gallup presentation on Black voices, and in particular Black voices in Detroit. When it comes to voices, mine is not black. I hear one of my kids telling me, "Thank you, Captain Obvious." But I think it's really important, and if there's anything that speaks to the power of and, I believe deeply that people who look like me and have position like me need to not only be part of this conversation, but to be held accountable for the outcomes. And I implore those of you who are not invested in this conversation to become invested in this conversation, because it's not only important for Detroit, it's important for the region, it's important for the country, so we all have a stake. And getting back to the question about how business and this important issue intersects, Kelly is a big company. We have thousands of employees. We operate in almost every state in the country. We work with for-profit companies, not-for-profit companies, governments. We're the largest provider of substitute teachers in the U.S. So we have broad exposure. And I can tell you unequivocally that the best performing companies that we deal with, more than 10,000, are those that have embraced the idea that opening up opportunity for more people is good business. It's the right thing to do, of course, but it's also good business. And we see time and time again the best performing across sectors among the companies we serve are those companies that, like B of A, has adopted a deliberate, disciplined, data-driven approach to DEI that they measure and produces outcomes that support the idea that selling to the communities that we all serve, being representative of that in your employee base is a good start. So that's clear. But this is not Diversity 101 pablum. We have done our own research to correlate with what Gallup has done. We talked to 1,500 C-level executives, 5,000 of their employees, and we can we released this in May. It's called Rework. We've done it for a number of years, but we released the most recent version in May. You can find it on our website, costplusdrugs.com.
It was a different panel.
That's the other billionaire. kellyservices.com. But it establishes very clearly the correlation between the best financial performing companies are those that embrace not only diversity from a representation standpoint, but equity and inclusion in the workforce. So it is unequivocal, and I encourage any company, business owner, organization that has not gotten the message, happy to talk to you about all of the body of work that goes into what I just talked about.
Yeah. Camille, I want to have you draw a few connections for us. One between the drivers of the data that we see, and then connecting that to the solutions to the things that we see. I think there's a continuum that I think we have to acknowledge up here, which is that corporate America, our economic system, is part of what creates the data that we see in places like Detroit. At the same time, the reason we're having this conversation is because corporate interests have tremendous opportunity to change that. But I want to have you just kind of talk about how those things interconnect across that divide.
Absolutely. So one of the things that we see in the data is this ability, the perception of being able to get ahead by working hard. I think what could be discouraging is more than just like, I want a job, right? But you start to think about, well, what does a good job look like for me? It's an opportunity to go somewhere to work where I feel like I can contribute meaningfully to the organization's mission, but that I can do so being who I am or showing up how I want to show up, and that I have a fighting chance in terms of my ability to leverage opportunities within those organizations. So one of the things is saying, when we look at some of the data as to why Detroiters say that they would look to leave their employers, I think next to higher salary, that was number one, but also better benefits. The other thing was this idea of being able to leverage opportunity. And so when you start to think about creating equitable systems within organizations and letting individuals who work for you feel like they have an ability, like anyone else in the organization, to leverage those opportunities, I think that's really what you're hearing and what we see in some of the national data around what workers' experiences are like and how confident they feel in their ability to achieve their career goals at the organizations that they currently work. And you're saying those who are able to give that a 5 are significantly more likely to say that they had no intention to leave their organization within the next year. So when you start to think about, well, why is that important? With the war for talent and thinking about, creating environments where employees want to work and where they feel like they can achieve their career goals is very much important to organizations and businesses' bottom line, as well as creating conditions for workers to feel like, they can achieve their life goals, right? And achieve equitable life outcomes by working here. So I do think that there's a strong connection related to what people are saying that they want and expect from their employers.
Yeah. I want to have our panelists each talk about outcome and how you measure outcome outside of your company first. But what tells you that the things that you're doing are making a difference? What tells you that the things that you're doing are correcting some of the data that we saw in the report? Ron, I'll start with you this time.
I think anecdotal feedback is really important. We're a small enough company that it's important to me when I interact with employees walking around, our 4 facilities. There are 2, as I said, in Metro Detroit, 1 outstate, and then 1 in the Southeast. I learn a lot, every time I walk the production floor, as people will approach me and just share a little bit about what their day-to-day experiences are at the company, what's working for them, what's not. And we absolutely, go back to the HR team and talk about, how can we make this a little better in this way or that way? You can't do a whole lot. Manufacturing is what it is. particularly for a just-in-time manufacturer like us that's, producing at pace and online with the automaker assembly plant that we're supplying. But you have to try to keep people engaged, I think, by responding to the things that matter to them. So, for example, we years ago began allocating a portion of our discretionary budget for employee teams to decide how we would support the communities, right? We want to support the organizations that you're involved in away from work. We want to support the organizations that are important to you. Here's the mission of our community relations team. What do you think of that? We donate a lot of money for education causes because that really resonates with employees, for example. Like, how can we do some things beyond, being able to raise wages, which, are never as high as any of us want. I tell people all the time, I'd love to be able to pay everybody $35 an hour to put car seats together, but that's not the way the business model works. And I don't want to apologize for what the business model is. This is where we are. And so how do we make this workable so that you want to come here every day and do a great job and that you leave here knowing that your contributions mattered? A lot of it's just that at the margin employee engagement stuff.
So your business is in a community. It's in a pretty tight-knit community in the city of Detroit. Talk about how this plays out in the relationship between the business and the folks who live near you.
Well, I want to say this carefully because I know Frank Venegas is in the audience.
I was going to say,
he's
Frank's
the
here
mayor of
somewhere,
Southwest
right?
Detroit for sure. And hey, we have learned a lot following Ideal Group's, example. I mean, I think they have been, the corporate leaders of that side of town. And when, they call and say, hey, we're going to sign up to support this or support that, and we want the business community to rally, we always rally to what they're doing. And there are a few other firms like that. And we like to think, there's some things that we lead on and support, that other business community members will come and support. It seems to work. We have a lot of employees who live near the plants, both plants, in the area, and really seem to care about the fact that, we support the community efforts surrounding the plants. And, we show up at the meetings and we care about the public safety stuff, and we keep it's all the little things that just require attention from leadership that will communicate to people in ways large and small. Hey, we see what you're dealing with. We see a way to make, your world working for us a little bit better, so we're trying. And Warren, I'll use an example. We had, an auto theft problem out there, as did other businesses out near Van Dyke and 696. And we put up fencing around the property and automatic gates and brought in a level of security that we hadn't had to have in 15 years. But it's one of the things that kind of changed for us post-COVID, was that part of the landscape. And it was important to me that the employees see us respond to that, fairly immediately. That's an investment, but I think those are the ways, you communicate to people that, again, hey, what you do here matters. And, we care about everything that's going on with you, not only about the output going out the doors.
Yeah. Peter, external outcomes that tell you that what you're doing is working.
Yeah, so thank you. Kelly's in a slightly unique position because we have more than 7,000 full-time employees, but we also put about 350,000 people to work, and about 50 to 60,000 people find permanent work through Kelly. So we have a very broad touch point to the labor community. Camille mentioned the importance of DE&I in the workplace. One of the things I'm very passionate about, Kelly's very passionate about, is creating more access to meaningful work. So I want to get more people to the workplace so we can create a more equitable path. In 2020, we announced something called Equity at Work, which is a program designed to shed a spotlight on barriers to preventing more people from finding access to work. And I think the results today indicate that work is an important component, economic opportunity, jobs and work is an important component of the success of a city, of a region, again, of a country. So Equity at Work focuses on things like requiring a 4-year degree when some other credential, a bachelor's degree, military service would qualify, automatically disqualifying one of the 75 million Americans that have some blemish on their criminal record, having drug requirements or drug screening requirements that eliminate automatically 30%. That's all good, but the connection to what we're talking about today is a lot of the people who are most impacted by those barriers are people of color. It's just a simple mathematical truth. So when companies close the top of the funnel because of one of those reasons, they're preventing more people of color to have the opportunity to work. And regardless of political affiliation, I think we can all agree that a job is good for a person, their family, the community, the country, the economy. So we were and have been very pleased with the results for that. But getting back to the question about measurement, we didn't really have a way to measure it. My team came up with a way using technology to measure the impact that we are having on individuals who are facing some kind of barrier. And while it's early, it's 3 months of data, there were more than 1,000 individuals that found work that had one of these barriers existed prior, they would not have found work. 1,000 individuals working, more than 1,000, working with more than 25 companies. Now, that's 3 months. If you think about if that was 250 companies or 2,500 companies, what a difference we could make to creating access to work. So then we can be talking about, okay, then how do we create mobility with work? How do we address some of these other issues at work? But I'm very pleased with the results. And by the way, for those of you who are employers, of that population, the turnover rate is 4.5%. 4.5%, because they're appreciative, they're loyal, and our ability to fill those jobs has gone up considerably, again, because we don't have to fight with a barrier.
Cynthia?
Just really building off of what Camille said, because I think she made a really important point. One of the things that you'll see in our annual report, it shows our employee engagement, and it's going to show you a trend line that looks like this. The D&I index is the same way. That's how we measure inclusion. There's a lot of debate on how you measure inclusion. I would say pick a term and measure it. Because the opposite of not feeling included is excluded, which means you don't belong. And so we sometimes get lost in semantics. It's important we're really clear, because it's two elements. One element is, can people bring their whole selves to work, and do they have equal access to opportunity regardless of difference? What you also see on that same trend line of engagement and D&I going up is turnover that goes down. So you want to attract an incredibly diverse workforce that wants to work there, and they will give back to the community, and we see that in our numbers. So that's number one. And how do we do that? By creating a culture of inclusion. Again, we measure it. So every employee, every manager across the bank has their own inclusion index and their D&I index. You heard from our CEO yesterday that said it's embedded in talent planning. So you just can't perform. You have to drive an inclusive environment. And we define what that means at the company, and we measure it. And then we hold leaders accountable. The other element that was also being discussed was, well, what do we do in the community? And we do a lot. I'll give you some examples. So one of our commitments was around $1.25 billion around economic opportunity. We measure the impact. So it's just not about making a statement. It's about devoting those dollars in the community. They're around things like workforce development. We have been hiring. We hired 10,000 people from low to moderate income without college degrees. We double down in hiring another 10,000. It's around entrepreneurship. The work we're doing, particularly as the pandemic that impacted Black and brown entrepreneurs specifically, we've been doubling down with financial investments and support. It's about addressing things like health equity, another commitment, because the impact, particularly in Black and brown communities from the pandemic, were disproportionately impacted in certain groups. So we went into specific certain communities, and through the help of the market, have been deliberately distributing funds and dollars to help address inequities around health. And then the last area is housing. We have a $15 billion commitment. It's all devoted about providing grants and to provide more ownership, which we know is access to equity, particularly in communities that have not had that same access. So my follow-up is, we have to be true to data and facts and not just talk about these commitments, but show what we're specifically doing to move the needle.
Yeah. We do have a number of audience questions, and I think this one is a really great one. It says, the top barrier for Detroiters accessing work is lack of transportation. What can businesses and employers do to address this challenge? And the reason I think that's a great question is because, as the data shows in the survey, this is a really complex set of issues that all tie themselves up together in the knots to hold people back from opportunity. It may not be obvious to a lot of employers that transportation is something they need to be focused on to give people opportunity to get to work. It's not a traditional role necessarily of companies, but it matters in places like Detroit. So I wonder what you make of that suggestion. I'll start with you this time, Peter.
Yeah, so we don't have a lot of experience in Detroit with respect to solving that problem, but working with other companies who have high concentrations of potential employees in an environment and a commuting requirement where there's not mass transportation, we have worked with them to create private, busing solutions that have a regular cadence of transportation that runs through the day. It pays for itself when you think about the cost of production lines not being open or the cost of turnover or people absenteeism. We also have had some clients that have gotten very creative with including either an Uber or a Lyft ride as part of compensation or as part of the package so that individuals can take advantage of that. If it's available, it's not available everywhere, but if it's available so they can get to work without having to worry about whatever the cost is, and the employer builds that into the economic equation. And while I wouldn't say that's widespread, people are thinking about this issue. And again, I don't have a solution for Detroit per se, but I think there's opportunity to come up with creative solutions in the right situation.
I'd like
Cynthia?
to elevate maybe the question just a little bit around a full suite of benefits. And I do think that this is really important. We do have commuter compensation benefits. We actually doubled down on a lot of that during the pandemic to help individuals, particularly those in critical roles that had to go in and weren't able to work from home at the time. But it's all types of benefits. I mean, when we look at our parental support, it's raising our minimum wage. We're now at $22. We've committed to $25 by 2025. It's about not raising medical premiums for our employees, particularly those who make under a certain amount of money. It's about creating jobs so every employee at the bank is living and has a sustainable wage and not having to work 2 or 3 jobs to make ends meet. We focus on wellness and emotional support, financial support. I mean, I will tell you that the benefits across this company are top notch, and we double down on many of those even during the most critical times of the last several years. Why? Because you want people coming in and living and being able to work a true sustainable job at your company. And so we have to really think about this whole suite of benefits and how you support your employees as a component of being a great place to work.
Ron?
I agree with all that, and I'm sitting here, envying companies the size of B of A. Because in my world, as an auto supplier, we have talked about some of these issues. Local businesses have talked about maybe we want to put together a private transportation service, because for sure, transportation and childcare are the 2 biggest barriers that people who work for us and people who want to work for us have to coming to work or joining our workforce. Generally, the feedback we get is the pay is okay, the benefits are great, but man, transportation and childcare are the barriers for me. And so we are aware of it. There have been off and on conversations with various coalitions of business groups to try to address some of that. So I'll own it a little and say I have not been smart enough to yet figure out how to make the cost part of the model work. The state has come up with a program where they'll pay, a third of childcare fees in certain instances. Well, $3,500, per child, when I've got separate collective bargaining agreements at each facility is, a lot to navigate in, the low margin world of automotive, commoditized space. And so I think that, and I've seen this with larger efforts in the industry, when the OEs say, okay, this needs to happen, when a General Motors or Ford or a Stellantis or whomever says, we want to see this happen for our employees, and we expect suppliers to adopt these approaches as well. And yes, we understand we'll have to make some room in the purchase order for that. That's when it'll happen.
Yeah.
True.
I would say to the transit question in particular, one thing that I think could be really powerful is the voice that you guys have and the influence that you can have over the public process, right? What are we all doing up here? This is where we bring business and government and philanthropic leaders together, supposedly to solve our problems. You have tremendous access to the people who make decisions about public transit in our region and our state. Of course, it is abhorrent in the city of Detroit. You have a lot more opportunity than a lot of people to be able to make the case for that being better. Last question. Someone was moved by Peter's comments about white leadership on this issue. They wonder how we get more people to have the courage to do that. That does take some courage for white folks to say, look, this is our problem as much as anybody else's. It doesn't happen all the time. So I wonder what each of you think we can do to, again, encourage more people to be in this space. Cynthia?
There was a piece in LinkedIn that I wrote around sort of after George Floyd, and it was around what do we tell our children. And at the time, it was because my son, I have 4 children, 2 of them are boys, 2 females, but my son at the time, when we were living in New York, told me he was afraid to walk to summer camp. And that was because he was seeing what was going on in the world. That was the Pulse nightclub shooting years that impacted the LGBTQ+, plus the Hispanic community. I think that was Alton Sterling and Philando Castile. There were the police officers, but he was seeing sort of this loss of life. And then I think he started to see him as a black man in society. And the whole piece was around we each have a role. We can look to corporations, all these leaders are doing their part, but what are we each doing individually within our own circle of influence? And the question is, if we either think that there's truly inclusive environments for all or not, but silence, I think Dr. Martin Luther King was the one who said, I not only hear the words of my enemies, but the silence of my friends. And I think it's really important to understand that in this moment, particularly it's super polarized, I understand that. But we each have a voice, we each have a responsibility, we each have a cause, and we could do our part to truly create inclusion for all if we believe that that doesn't exist. So I think it starts with each one of us in the room, understanding what our role is.
I'd like to lift up especially the importance of professional allyship. We were talking about this a little bit backstage. So, Bridgewater is, a $2 billion a year company that would not exist if John Barth hadn't decided, 25 years ago, this is important and I'm going to lean into this space. If Harold Kuttner, who was leading General Motors purchasing at the time, another white guy, hadn't decided, this is important, this is the right thing to do, this is ultimately good for the business, I'm going to lean into this space. And they, created a company that, has been a part of a broader movement that has created, I should know the numbers, I'm sorry, I don't, but, thousands and thousands of jobs and millions and probably hundreds of millions of dollars in compensation for black and brown people and higher levels of participation for them in one of the most important, maybe the most important manufacturing industry driving the national economy. Would not happen without allyship. Yes, people like, my father and my colleagues and me today, have to step through the door and have to make the most of the opportunity, but you've got to get the opportunity because somebody who was in power decided, that's important. And it's still important. I'm at all levels. I see it all the time in my career. Again, we were talking about this a little bit backstage. Allyship is important. Certainly everybody in this room can do something, and more than you do now. It's not enough that you're not a racist. How are you helping to make society more inclusive?
Camille, I think the question to you is how do we elevate the exposure to this data? How do we get this to the people who need to hear it, need to see it, and then need to act on it?
Yeah, so Stephen, I love the question. I'll say this. Contemplation is a luxury and a privilege, and I think if we all can acknowledge that, the ability to contemplate, am I courageous enough? Do I have the ability to, is a luxury, because when you think about work around equity, if you're in a position to do that, it means you're not the one that is feeling the brunt of the inequities that exist in our society. So I would say that contemplation is a luxury, but I'll also say it's democratizing expertise. And then that's why we think about the data that we are collecting and the work that we're doing to amplifying resident voices or amplifying those who are having those experiences into these conversations, I think is a way to do that in the exposure. Because oftentimes we'll all come here and all of the experts and the policy heads and the leaders will talk about it. How can we center resident voices into these conversations, I think is a way to kind of elevate people's experiences into decision making.
Yeah.
I'll be very brief. I would say, there was a time where the answer would be you can't tolerate any behavior that supports anything that's going to disadvantage anybody unfairly. That's clearly not enough. There was a time when treating everybody equally, and I will tell you that was for a long time. I thought that's, blind justice, that was me, treat everybody equally, and I've done my part. But what I've learned in the seasoned years of my career is that is not enough. This has to be active participation. You have to work diligently and thoughtfully and deliberately to radically change the way and the narrative that we've lived with for too long. And that requires, again, everybody, including people that look like me, to raise their voices, get in the ring with us, and we'll advance. And next year or the year after, the results will show, I'm sure.
Yeah.
We'll be there to measure it.
Yeah, there's a.
That's right.
One of the things I think to the point we have to address is this theory of like a zero-sum game and as it relates to diversity and inclusion. This belief of more for someone means less for me. And, you were starting to sort of say there's all kinds of studies that have told us for years that actually it should grow the pie. But why we keep coming back to that gets in the way, I think, of why sometimes there's a belief in acting or how it's perceived. There was a quote that said, equity for all doesn't mean less for you, it's not pie. And I like to think about that because I think we have to start challenging these fundamental beliefs and assumptions that are deeply held that get in our way of truly driving the work that needs to be done and creating a more inclusive environment for all.
Yeah. So great way to end this conversation. I want to thank our panelists and, of course, thank the audience for your great questions as well.